You don't belong here. Those were the words Lorraine Eckhart hissed as she poured gasoline around Julius Merrick's car and flicked her lighter. What she didn't realize was that her target had been watching, documenting every move. How does a neighborhood dispute escalate into criminal arson in just 90 days? For Julius, the betrayal cut deep as harmless violation notices transformed into a campaign of intimidation. But what happens when the homeowner you targeted possesses exactly the skills needed to bring you down? The security footage of Lorraine's arrest left the entire community in shock, revealing the truth no one saw coming. What happens when a neighborhood becomes one person's personal kingdom? Highland Crest wasn't just another pristine American suburb with manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. It was Lorraine Eckhart's domain, a kingdom where her word was law and her judgment was final. It all began innocently enough. Lorraine joined the Highland Crest Homeowners Association as a secretary, leveraging her administrative background to quickly ascend the ranks. Within 2 years, she became vice president, and by year 3, she was unanimously elected president. Partly because she was the only candidate willing to take on the responsibility, and partly because potential opponents already feared her disapproval. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Routine enforcement of community guidelines morphed into a system of control. Her clipboard became a scepter, her signature on violation notices a royal decree that few dare to question. The HOA handbook transformed from 15 pages when she started to 74 pages within 3 years, Mariachin confided, her voice dropping to a whisper as she glanced nervously at her own front lawn. Each new rule somehow expanded her authority to monitor, fine, or control our lives. Lorraine's psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective. She cultivated an environment where neighbors informed on each other to avoid becoming her next target. Monthly HOA meetings devolved into public tribunals where violations were displayed and offenders named. You leave those meetings feeling naked, exposed. One resident admitted, you drive home wondering if your mailbox is an inch too tall or your garbage invisible from the wrong angle. Her daily inspection walks became a neighborhood ritual of fear. Residents peered through blinds as she documented every infraction with her digital camera. Her meticulous records filled binders, photographs, dates, times, detailed descriptions of violations, no matter how insignificant. The casualties of her reign accumulated. Elaine Withers, grieving her husband of 48 years, received a violation for her burgundy door the day after his funeral. The Martinez family surrendered their son's basketball hoop after months of harassment about recreational equipment visibility, crushing the boys' athletic aspirations. Board members who questioned her decisions found themselves drowning in violation notices. Former Treasurer David Abernathy accumulated $2,700 in fines within 2 months of suggesting a financial audit. He resigned shortly after, his house on the market within 6 months. I started planning my day around her schedule, admitted a resident who requested anonymity. I'd only garden when I knew she was at her hair appointment. Living here feels like being under constant surveillance. Perhaps most concerning was Lorraine's financial control. Highland Crest's substantial HOA fees generated a budget she managed with minimal oversight. Community improvements suspiciously concentrated around her property. Decorative street lamps ended just past her block, and repaved walking paths followed her morning route while neglecting other areas. Her system created a neighborhood where conformity became mandatory for survival. Paint colors, mailbox designs, even permitted garden flowers reflected Lorraine's personal preferences rather than written guidelines. Appeals proved futile, resulting only in increased scrutiny. The community transformed under her rule. Neighbors who once chatted across driveways now hurried from cars to front doors, avoiding eye contact. Children played in backyards rather than front lawns, where they might violate a noise ordinance. The vibrant community spirit evaporated, replaced by a pervasive anxiety that hung over Highland Crest like a storm cloud, darkening the lives of everyone within its shadow. While Highland Crest residents lived beneath Lorraine's storm cloud of anxiety, one house stood in perpetual sunshine, legally untouchable by her regulations or fines. The modest 2-story colonial with slightly weathered blue trim at 1742, Oakridge Drive existed in a legal dimension where Lorraine's extensive rulebook held no more authority than blank pages. The property was permanently grandfathered out of HOA jurisdiction, built decades before Highland Crest officially became an association-controlled community. This exemption represented more than a legal technicality buried in property records. It embodied a freedom that stood in direct opposition to Lorraine's carefully constructed order. The home's weathered character and distinctive appearance contrasted with the neighborhood's enforced uniformity, like a solitary oak among a forest of identical saplings, visibly demonstrating the limits of her authority. When Julius Merrick purchased the property, he made a calculated decision based on extensive research into the neighborhood's history and governance structure. His background had given him a particular sensitivity to environments where power concentrated in too few hands. Only later would neighbors discover the strategic nature of his choice, a deliberate selection by someone with professional expertise in recognizing problematic power dynamics. This was a mere coincidence, as one neighbor later explained, but a calculated move by someone who recognized the patterns of control she had perfected. From the moment Julius moved in, his property stood as a visible contradiction to Lorraine's authority. While other homes displayed the rigid conformity she enforced, identical mailboxes, approved paint schemes, standardized landscaping, Julius's home preserved the neighborhood's original character. The mature oak trees in his yard had witnessed Highland Crest's transformation from a diverse community to Lorraine's controlled territory. His home's architecture, with its personal touches and unique features, served as a living museum of what the neighborhood had once been. For Lorraine, Julius's exemption represented something profoundly threatening, a crack in her perfect system of control. Each time residents walked past his home, they witnessed tangible proof that her authority had limitations. The psychological impact of this exception undermined the foundation of fear she had carefully constructed. The visible freedom enjoyed by one household raised uncomfortable questions about the restrictions endured by everyone else. As neighbors would later learn, Julius's career as a federal prosecutor specializing in corruption cases had equipped him to recognize the subtle tactics of intimidation that had become Lorraine's trademark. Where other homeowners retreated in fear of confrontation, he stood firm within the legal boundaries protecting his property, approaching her dictates with the analytical mind of someone who had spent decades dismantling similar systems of control. As weeks passed, Lorraine's initial irritation transformed into obsession. She began spending hours researching legal avenues to force Julius's compliance. Despite knowing his property was protected, neighbors reported seeing her parked across from his house, documenting every detail as if building a case. She requested original property records, hunting for technical loopholes that might invalidate his exemption. Her fixation revealed the desperation of someone watching their carefully constructed order face its first real challenge. For residents who had lived under Lorraine's rule long enough to forget alternatives existed, Julius's home offered a glimpse of freedom. They observed with quiet fascination as he made modest changes to his property without seeking approval, planted flowers that weren't on the approved list, and lived without the constant anxiety of violation notices. His exemption demonstrated a different way of existing within the community, a living reminder of what Highland Crest had once been and might become again. The freedom Julius enjoyed represented everything Lorraine couldn't tolerate, a living contradiction to her authority. In most neighborhoods, disputes revolve around minor inconveniences. But when someone builds their identity around control, what happens when they encounter the one person they can't subjugate? For Julius Merrick, the answer arrived in his mailbox just 3 days after he installed a modest garden bed. An official-looking violation, notice claiming his grass exceeded the permitted height limit by half an inch. Julius stood in his front yard, notice in hand, staring at his freshly mowed lawn with bewilderment. The absurdity might have been comical if it hadn't signaled something more sinister. This was Lorraine's opening salvo in what would become a relentless campaign of intimidation. The grass violation was merely the beginning. Soon came citations for unauthorized wind chimes and improper mailbox orientation, despite his mailbox matching every other on the street. "These notices feel like paper bullets," Julius murmured, carefully filing each one away. When these fabricated violations failed to break him, a tipping point emerged. Anonymous complaints to city officials materialized, claiming illegal business activities. His legally parked car vanished one morning, towed away based on reports of abandonment, despite being moved daily. Unauthorized signs appeared at the edges of his property, creating false impressions of hostility. The targeting wasn't subtle, recalled Marcus Jennings from 2 doors down. We'd watch Lorraine circle Julius's house, like a hawk, notepad in hand. Sometimes she'd stand across the street for 30 minutes, camera raised, muttering to herself. This surveillance represented calculated psychological warfare. Lorraine created elaborate dossiers of alleged violations, meticulously documenting Julius's every movement. She monitored his garbage bins, his mail delivery, even the timing of his porch lights, all in her obsessive quest to manufacture wrongdoing. The community's response revealed the fear Lorraine had cultivated. Neighbors expressed private support, but remained publicly silent. "I wanted to speak up," admitted Eleanor Whitaker from across the street. But Lorraine had threatened to revoke pool privileges for families who associated with non-compliant elements. That's how she referred to Julius, an element, not a person. Julius responded with prosecutorial precision. Each letter, an incident went into chronological files. His security cameras captured Lorraine's frequent drive-bys. His responses remained professional, always ending with, "As previously established, this property is exempt from HOA governance." He denied Lorraine the emotional reaction. She sought to prove he was disruptive. The turning point came during a quarterly HOA meeting. "We have a serious situation developing," she announced, voice tightening. "There's an element that threatens everything we've built. Mr. Merrick represents a direct challenge to our community values." The room fell silent as Lorraine stared at Julius. Some people simply don't belong in communities like ours. The racial undertone wasn't lost on anyone, especially considering Julius was one of only 3 black homeowners in Highland Crest. Neighbors noticed Lorraine's behavior becoming increasingly erratic. "She'd be out there odd hours," said Harold Lester, an elderly insomniac. "Sometimes at 3 in the morning, just standing at her property's edge. I heard her once. Something about taking care of the problem permanently." What began with violation notices had evolved into criminal intimidation, slash garden hoses, mysterious power outages affecting only Julius's home, and threatening notes left under darkness. Lorraine had crossed a line that, as a federal prosecutor, Julius recognized with absolute clarity. That invisible line Julius recognized had just been doused in gasoline. The acrid chemical smell drifted through his partially open window at 2:17 a.m., pulling his attention from case files to the darkness beyond. The security lights cast long shadows across his driveway, where a figure moved with deliberate purpose around his sedan. Julius felt his prosecutor's instincts activate. Not panic, but sudden laser-focused alertness. There was Lorraine Eckhart, methodically emptying a red container, the liquid glistening in the moonlight as it pooled around his tires. Julius reached for his phone with the measured calm of someone who had built countless cases against criminals who believed themselves untouchable. He began recording, capturing clear footage of Lorraine's face illuminated briefly as she tilted the container. Her movements were too calculated. This had been planned, perhaps rehearsed in her mind as her frustration mounted against the one homeowner she couldn't control. Evidence first, confrontation second, Julius whispered to himself, his prosecutor's mind cataloging each element: attempted arson, criminal trespass, destruction of property, federal charges carrying potential decades of imprisonment. He continued filming, knowing incomplete evidence might give her an escape route. Only when Lorraine reached into her pocket and produced a lighter did Julius finally move. In that chilling moment, justice began its counterattack. "Good evening, Lorraine," he called out, his voice steady as he stepped onto his porch. Phone still recording. "Something I can help you with?" The shock that registered on her face lasted only seconds before morphing into defiance. The lighter remained clutched in her hand, her body frozen between flight and completion. Highland Crest's self-appointed queen appeared genuinely confused, as if Julius's presence on his own property was a true transgression. "You don't belong here," she hissed, the words hanging in the night air between them. Julius maintained his position, careful to keep a safe distance while ensuring his camera captured every word. "Is that why you're attempting to set my car on fire? Because I don't belong." The racial implications were unmistakable. This wasn't about wind chimes anymore. It was about a black homeowner existing in a space Lorraine had deemed exclusively hers. Julius had prosecuted enough hate crimes to recognize racial animus hiding behind bureaucratic enforcement. "This is my neighborhood," Lorraine continued, her voice rising with strange confidence despite being caught in the act. She gestured with a lighter, the flame briefly illuminating her face. "I decide who stays and who goes." The psychological conflict playing across her features was fascinating. The rational awareness of being caught battling against her entrenched belief that rules simply didn't apply to her. "Lorraine," Julius said calmly, "put down the lighter and step away from my vehicle. What you're doing is attempted arson, a federal offense with serious consequences." He spoke not as a frightened victim, but as someone explaining inevitable outcomes. Her hand trembled. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Lorraine's face. The lighter snapped shut, but rather than retreating, she squared her shoulders. "You think you're untouchable because of your little exemption? There are other ways to handle people who don't fit in." Julius continued recording as she backed away, gasoline fumes heavy in the night air. He watched her retreat toward her own home until she disappeared from view. Only then did he call the police. His report detailed and precise, the evidence secured. The attempted arson marked a transformation in Lorraine's campaign. What had begun as administrative harassment had culminated in a crime, revealing the true nature of her obsession. Her statement, "You don't belong here," stripped away any pretense. This was about community standards. It exposed a mindset rooted in exclusion, in determining who had the right to exist in spaces she considered her domain. When federal SUVs rolled into Highland Crest that morning, neighbors emerged from their homes like cautious wildlife after a storm, sensing a shift in their ecosystem's balance of power. The woman who had decided who belonged and who then was about to face a force that operated beyond her sphere of influence, one that wouldn't be intimidated by HOA letterhead or threats about property values. The agents moved with practiced efficiency as they approached Lorraine Eckhart's immaculately maintained colonial. Some residents stood on their lawns in bathrobes, coffee mugs suspended halfway to their lips. Others peered through blinds, afraid that making themselves visible might somehow implicate them. Lorraine appeared in her doorway, wearing the same imperious expression she'd worn at countless HOA meetings, but it faltered as an agent presented the warrant. "This must be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." The declaration hung in the air, not an explanation but a statement of immunity, as if her position existed above federal law. The charges were read aloud with clinical precision: attempted arson, criminal trespass, harassment, and potential hate crime enhancements. Each charge dismantled another piece of the armor Lorraine had constructed around herself. A profound silence fell over Highland Crest as she was guided into the government vehicle. "I feel like I can breathe again," whispered Elaine Rodriguez from her porch. "That woman made my family feel unwelcome from the day we moved in." The community's reaction fractured along fault lines that had existed beneath Highland Crest's manicured surface. Martha Simmons spoke to reporters with trembling hands. "We lived in terror of that woman. I couldn't even plant a memorial garden for my husband without getting fined into oblivion." 2 doors down, Richard Peterson defended Lorraine. "She kept this neighborhood beautiful. People are ungrateful for what she sacrificed." Within days, the interim HOA board called an emergency meeting that revealed the extent of Lorraine's reign. Financial records showed irregularities, funds for community improvements that somehow always enhanced areas nearest to her property, invoices from companies that proved difficult to trace. More disturbing were the residents who finally felt safe enough to speak. An elderly couple described being fined after their grandson with autism made noises that Lorraine deemed disruptive. A single mother revealed how Lorraine had threatened to place a lien on her home when financial hardship caused her to miss one payment. Each story joined a constellation of controlled abuse invisible to those not directly targeted. The neighborhood transformed. Children's laughter, once muffled behind closed doors, spilled onto front lawns. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years introduced themselves for the first time. Gardens began to show touches of personality, small rebellions against years of enforced conformity. "We're learning to be neighbors again," said Marcus Jennings, hosting the community's first block party in a decade. I didn't realize how much we lost until we got it back." Throughout the proceedings, Julius maintained his ethical boundaries. Despite being the victim, he recused himself from any involvement in prosecuting Lorraine. When asked why he wouldn't use his position, Julius replied simply, "Because that's exactly what she would have done." What Julius demonstrated offers lessons in confronting intimidation. His careful documentation created an unassailable record. His patience prevented escalation. Most importantly, his understanding of legal boundaries allowed him to recognize when Lorraine's actions crossed from administrative harassment into criminal territory, giving a community back its soul in the process. Conclusion: today, the streets of Highland Crest carry a different energy. Where fear once silenced neighbors, a new sense of community blossoms. In the aftermath of Lorraine's removal, residents who once hurried past each other now stop to chat, exchanging more than just cautious nods. The trust doesn't return overnight. It rebuilds gradually, like a healing wound that requires time and care. The interim board has transformed meetings into forums for genuine discussion, where previously disengaged residents now actively participate. Highland Crest recovery mirrors nature's renewal after a harsh season. What was dormant now flourishes. Julius watches from his porch as neighbors reclaim their dignity and sense of belonging. In the space where intimidation once thrived, something far more powerful grows. A community defined not by what separates its members, but by what connects them. If this journey from fear to freedom resonated with you, your likes and comments help us continue sharing stories that matter. Stories of communities that heal together.